There's something that really puzzles me. I'm always on the hunt for interesting interview candidates, and just a couple of days ago, a high-ranking diplomat who was supposed to comment on Netanyahu's dismissal of Ronen Bar, the head of Shin Bet, that's Israel's internal security agency, declined because, and I quote, "we don't see eye to eye when it comes to Ukraine." So let me start this with a simple question. Why do some people see one war really clearly, but not the other? I'm not asking this rhetorically, I'm asking because I've seen smart, thoughtful, politically engaged people fall into this trap, lucid in one conflict and completely irrational in the other. So here's what this talk today is about. How information warfare and propaganda are used to create this selective lucidity. I show you how it works, I give you some concrete examples, and I tell you what you can do about it. You see, a lot of people are absolutely brilliant when they talk about one of today's major global conflicts, let's say the war in Gaza. They tell you about the history of Israeli occupation, the apartheid, the siege, the role of US foreign policy. They'll dissect propaganda like a surgeon. They get it. But when you then bring up Ukraine, suddenly it's like someone flipped the switch. Now they're repeating headlines from CNN. Putin is a madman, the next Hitler. Unprovoked invasion, my favorite. Defend democracy, support Ukraine at all costs. No mention of NATO expansion. No mention of the 2014 US instigated coup, and yes, it was a coup. No awareness of how the West has used Ukraine as a geopolitical chess piece to checkmate Russia. And here it comes. Flip it around and the same thing happens. There are people who are laser focused when it comes to Ukraine. They can explain how NATO provoked Russia, how the Minsk Accords were sabotaged, how Zelensky is a US-installed puppet. But then you ask them about Gaza and suddenly it's Israel has the right to defend itself. As if 75 years of brutal occupation never happened. As if apartheid is just a talking point. As if Palestinian resistance is terrorism, but Ukrainian resistance is heroism. So let me ask again, why? Why this split? Why this double vision? Why this selective lucidity? That's what this expose today is going to explore. Because I don't think it's about intelligence. I don't think it's about education. I think it's about something far more dangerous. Narrative control, media manipulation, and the subtle ways our own minds betray us when we think we're being objective. So I'm going to talk about propaganda, psychological bias, and how geopolitical interests are being sold to you not through lies, but through repetition, framing, and emotional manipulation. And don't worry, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to ask you if you are actually thinking. Because by the end of this talk, if you still believe you have been fully consistent in your thinking across both wars, that you've escaped the propaganda, then I will challenge you to prove it. Not to me, but to yourself. But before I now dive into it, let me just briefly mention that my Twitter account has been suspended. No big deal, I'm already building a community on Substack, a decentralized platform that no social media oligarch can shut down. So if you like my work, consider joining me there, the link's in the description. Okay, so for the purpose of this discussion, I take as starting point propaganda, but not in the way most people think about it. Because when I say the word propaganda, most people immediately picture some cartoonish enemy, a dictator on a poster, Soviet leaflets, North Korea, Hitler's propaganda czar, Goebbels, or Orwellian newsreels. But here's the twist. Propaganda in our world today, in your world, doesn't look like this at all. It doesn't scream in your face. Instead, it whispers. It whispers in your social media feed. It whispers in the news that you read. It whispers on TV. It feels like truth. In fact, the most effective propaganda is the kind that flies under the carpet, that evades all your mental defense mechanisms. It's not lies, it's structure. Let me explain what I mean. Propaganda today works by selecting which facts get repeated and which ones get buried. It works by shaping how events are framed. It works through repetition and emotional engagement that makes certain narratives morally unquestionable. And most of all, it works by controlling the starting point of the conversation. Remember this, I will come back to that, it's a trick. Take Ukraine for example. You've heard the phrase unprovoked invasion 1,000 times. It's in every headline. It's baked into every statement by every Western official. But have you ever stopped and asked yourself, why does that word, that specific word, matter so much? Why are they so obsessed with using the term unprovoked? Because if you accept the premise that it was unprovoked, then Russia is the villain, full stop, no context, no negotiation, no history. And if you started there, you never have to ask about NATO expansion. And never ask about the 2014 Maidan coup. You never ask about the 8 years of shelling in the Donbass by Ukraine with more than 14,000 casualties. So if the starting point is the Russian invasion, then everything that led to it is erased from public discourse and from your mind. Now shift to Palestine. Think about how many times you've heard Israel has the right to self-defense. Over and over. You hear that phrase so often it becomes an instinct, a reflex. You repeat it before you even know what exactly you are defending. But ask yourself this. Can an occupying power defend itself against the very people it's occupying? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the core of international law. But most people don't ask. Because propaganda doesn't just tell you what to think, it tells you what not to think. It creates blind spots. It sets emotional landmines. It frames resistance as terrorism and hegemony as protection. It makes violence look like security. It makes complicity look like morality. This is what Noam Chomsky called manufactured consent. I strongly recommend to read his book with the same title. It's a system where people believe they are making up their own minds, but their conclusions were being engineered from the beginning by how the information was structured. I interviewed him twice if you're interested. Now here's the dangerous part. Most people think they're immune. Not me. I'm too smart. And that's exactly why it works. Propaganda doesn't need your belief. It needs your attention, your silence, your assumptions. So here's your task. Every time you read a headline, every time you hear politicians speak, every time you feel emotional about the conflict, ask, whose story is this? Whose words am I repeating? And more importantly, what voices are missing? Because the moment you stop asking those questions, you're no longer thinking, you're participating. You think you came to your beliefs through logic and evidence, right? We all do. You did the research, you are not like them. You see through the noise, you've got clarity. But here's the interesting thing. Your brain is not on your side. It's wired to take shortcuts, to avoid discomfort, to cling to whatever makes you feel morally right, emotionally safe, and socially accepted. And guess what? Propaganda knows this. It doesn't fight your intelligence, it hijacks your instincts. Alright, I want you to think about the last time you read a news story that made your blood boil, really boil. Maybe it was about Ukraine. Maybe it was about Gaza. If you can, hold that feeling for a moment. And now ask yourself, why did it make me so angry? You see, our emotions are the battleground of modern propaganda. It's not just about feeding you information. It's about triggering feelings that bypass your rational mind. And the architects of these narratives, they understand human psychology better than we often understand ourselves. I am working on a piece about NATO's cognitive warfare program. But for now, let's just talk about cognitive biases. These are mental shortcuts our brains take to make sense of the world. They are very fast, almost instant, but they're not very accurate. For instance, there's the confirmation bias. our tendency to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs and dismiss what contradicts them way before you make a conscious decision. This mental shortcut is so strong that it can literally change how you see the world. It's not just a figure of speech. So if you already have internalized Russia as the aggressor, every news piece about Ukraine reinforces that view, and anything that doesn't fit gets ignored. Then there is the so-called availability bias, where we overestimate the importance of information that's most readily available. If the media constantly shows images of Israeli victims but hardly ever Palestinian suffering, guess whose pain feels more real to you? That too is a very strong bias because our brain is lazy. It takes the information most readily available simply to save time, reaction time, and energy. And lastly, let's not forget the in-group out-group bias, where the desire for harmony within a group lead to irrational decisions. The most famous experiment that every psychologist knows about is the Stanford prison experiment. One group of students was split into guards and prisoners, and the experimenter could hardly believe how quickly the guards became tyrants. No ideology, no history, no real conflict, just a role and the permission to dominate. And it's proved something terrifying. That in-group power doesn't need a reason, it just needs a uniform. In media organizations, this can result in unchallenged biases shaping coverage, as dissenting voices are silenced to maintain consensus. But here's something else. These biases aren't just quirks of human nature. They are exploited deliberately. Let me do some reinforcement here myself. Remember NATO's cognitive warfare program, coming soon. Consider this. During the Gaza conflict, studies have shown that Palestinians received far less sympathetic and humanizing coverage than Israelis or Ukrainians in similar situations. This isn't random. It's a calculated framing to shape your perception. And it's not just about what's shown. It's also about what's not shown. The omission of historical context, the starting point, the manipulation of the starting point of an event, the dehumanization of certain victims, the selective use of language. All these tactics prey on your cognitive biases to steer your beliefs. Remember, the most efficient propaganda doesn't tell you what to think. It shapes how you feel so you can come to the desired conclusion on your own. By understanding our cognitive biases, we can start to reclaim our agency in this psychological battlefield. You want a concrete example? Here's one of the oldest tricks in the propaganda playbook, the killed baby story. It sounds grotesque, and that's exactly the point. You want to turn a population from hesitant to bloodthirsty in a matter of days? Give them a story that bypasses their logic and goes straight for the limbic system. That's the part in our brain that regulates our emotions. It's an old trick because that's exactly what the US did already in World War I with the Creel Commission. A government propaganda machine set up to sell the American public on a war they didn't want. Woodrow Wilson had literally just been re-elected on the promise of keeping America out of the war. But then the Creel Commission started pumping out stories of German soldiers bayoneting babies in Belgium. Completely made up, but effective. The population flipped almost overnight. Fast forward to 1990. Iraq invades Kuwait and America needs public support for yet another war. What do we get? The infamous incubator baby story. A teenage girl sobbing in front of the American Congress claimed Iraqi soldiers stormed Kuwaiti hospitals, threw the babies out of the incubators and left them to die on the cold floor. Pure evil. Except it wasn't true.
I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country. The second week after invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The girl was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, coached by a US PR firm called Hill and Norton. Entirely staged. But it worked. It ignited righteous fury across the US and helped pave the way for Desert Storm. And just recently, what did we hear in the first days after October the 7th, 2023? That Hamas had beheaded 40 Israeli babies. Not just killed, beheaded. That number was everywhere. 40. Politicians repeated it. Journalists ran it without confirmation. President Biden even said he saw photos. What a lie. Until the White House quickly had to walk back. Because guess what? There was no proof. It was never confirmed.
I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children. I never thought I'd ever... Anyway.
It was a story designed to shut down your moral capacity, to shut off debate, and to make you scream for vengeance. And once you believe the enemy is subhuman, there's no limit to what you'll justify. So now the question becomes, what do you do about it? You start by putting yourself on trial. When you see a story that hits you emotionally, pause, ask, why do I feel this way? Who benefits from this version of events? What's being left out? Not because your emotions are wrong, but because they're being used. This isn't about guilt, it's about awareness. Because once you understand how your mind works and how power uses that against you, you can start reclaiming your perception. And that's when real lucidity begins. For those who believe they are immune, you can test your own cognitive biases on the website of the Stanford University. But be warned, the experience can be so discomforting that they even included a disclaimer. I have a link in the description. Alright, I think now is the time to ask you this. Do you believe you're seeing the whole picture when you turn on the news? Because here's the reality, you're not supposed to. What you're seeing is the frame, a carefully chosen frame. And whoever controls that frame controls the story and ultimately your perception of what's happening in the world. Now look, I'm not talking about cartoonish conspiracy theories. I'm not saying there's a smoky back room with evil men in suits deciding the headlines. It doesn't work like that. It's much more sophisticated and more dangerous because it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like journalism. Let's briefly start with media ownership. You know how many companies control most of what Americans see, read and hear? 5. That's it. 5 mega conglomerates owning everything from cable news to movie studios to newspapers to streaming platforms. Comcast, Disney, Warner Bros, Discovery, Paramount Global. You think they exist to inform you? No, they exist to sell you a worldview and sell ads while they're at it. And they're not neutral. They have interests. Financial, political, military. And those interests shape what stories get told and how. That's the frame. And I'm not even talking about platforms such as Twitter, Facebook and Google. I made a separate clip about them, links in the description. Okay, now let's zoom in. Think about who gets invited on TV to explain the war in Ukraine or Gaza. Retired generals, NATO officials, analysts from think tanks with names like Atlantic Council or Center for Strategic and International Studies. Sounds impressive, right? Now go look at who funds them. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, ExxonMobil, the State Department, the Pentagon. These are not neutral voices. These are mouthpieces of empire dressed up as experts. And what you don't hear? You don't hear voices from Gaza. You don't hear Russian dissidents who oppose both Putin and NATO. You don't hear from academics who talk about US hegemony or historical colonialism. You don't even hear voices from US diplomats like US ambassadors Charles Freeman and Jack Matlock or Hala Rarit and Mike Casey, who recently resigned in protest. You can only find these voices on channels like mine. Links to all of them are in the description. Why? Because they don't fit the frame. And here's the thing, it's not always a conspiracy, it's an ecosystem. Journalists know which lines not to cross. Editors know what won't get passed in the boardrooms. Reporters self-censor because they want to keep their jobs. That's how the frame maintains itself. If you don't believe me, watch my interview with the head of Associated Press for the Middle East, Dan Perry. Links in the description. So let me hit you with the question again. Do you really think you're seeing the whole picture? Because if all your information is coming from the same few corporations, the same Washington insiders, the same military-funded think tanks, then you're not informed. You are being processed. You have to realize you don't live in a free information system. You live in a curated one. And the curation is done by people with vested interests in keeping you angry at the enemies and loyal to the allies. So break the frame. Step outside it. Look at the stories they ignore. Look at the words they use. Retaliation, defense, terrorist, unprovoked. As a behavior analyst, I can tell you that language is a weapon. And if you're not careful, it's being aimed right at your perception. Let's take Ukraine and Gaza as a case study. Ukraine first. You've heard it 1,000 times by now. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked. No context, no history, starting point pushed forward. Just bad guy invades good guy. That's the framing. And it works, because it's clean, moral and easy to digest. But here's the problem. It's fiction. Not because Russia didn't invade, they did, but because the story didn't start in February 2022. The starting point goes way back because it started decades earlier. And if you cut out everything that led up to it, you're not reporting, you're doing public relations for power. Let's rewind for a moment. Back in the early 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the US and its NATO allies gave assurances to Moscow no eastward expansion. Not an inch, James Baker told Gorbachev. And yet what followed? NATO expanded in waves. Poland, Hungary, the Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria and more. Each moved closer to Russia's border. But sure, we are told that's just paranoia, right? By the time NATO started flirting openly with Ukraine, a country with deep historical, economic and military ties to Russia, that wasn't seen as diplomacy. That was a red line. And Washington knew it because CIA Chief Bill Burns warned that Ukraine is the reddest of red lines for Putin and his complete inner circle. Then came 2014, the turning point the media refuses to talk about honestly. Ukraine's democratically elected president Viktor Yanukovych rejected a UE deal in favor to closer ties with Moscow. The West lost it. What followed wasn't a protest, it was a coup, plain and simple. And that's not just me saying that. Western-backed NGOs, US officials like Victoria Nuland and John McCain handing out cookies on the ground. Leaked calls with American diplomats literally discussing who should be in the next government. This wasn't a democratic revolution, it was a regime change operation and it worked. A pro-Western, anti-Russian government was installed. Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the east, especially the Donbas, rebelled. Civil war broke out. Kiev sent in the military, shelling, bombing, civilians killed. This didn't start in 2022. It started years before and over 14,000 people died in that period. Did you hear anything about that on CNN? To stop the bloodshed, the Minsk agreements were signed, with the promise of autonomy for the Donbas. But Kiev didn't honor it. And here's the absolutely stunning kicker. Angela Merkel and François Hollande later admitted those deals were never meant to be implemented. No wonder Putin doesn't trust the West. They were a stall tactic, a way to buy Ukraine time to build up its military. Let that sink in. A peace agreement, an officially signed peace agreement, used to prepare for more war. And now people wonder why Putin doesn't agree to Trump's peace deal. And trust me, he will not. So by the time Russia invaded in 2022, wrong as that act was, it wasn't out of the blue. It was the predictable outcome of years of provocation, deception and geopolitical gamesmanship. And yet here we are in March 2025, 3 years into the war, and US officials still call it a fight for freedom and democracy. President Trump frames it in terms of Western strength and deterrence, while NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte insists it's about our shared values, parroting Ursula von der Leyen. But still, no mentioning of NATO expansion, no mentioning of the 2014 coup, no mentioning of Donbass, Minsk, the Nord Stream attacks or the diplomatic sabotage that preceded the invasion. Just a recycled script of heroes and villains, good versus evil, and silence where history should be told. And you, the audience, are expected to cheer from the sidelines. So let me ask you again, was it really unprovoked? Or was it provoked, cornered and then narratively laundered for Western consumption? If you're lucid on Gaza, you should be lucid here too, no? If you can see occupation and provocation there, why not here? Because if you think you're getting the full story from the West's version of events, you're not. You're getting the war version of a Disney script. But war isn't Disney. It's blood, lies and power. And now let's contrast this to Gaza. Those who still think what's happening in Palestine is a conflict, let's be honest, they're not paying attention. Or they are too deep in the propaganda because this isn't a clash of equals. It's not complicated. It's occupation, it's apartheid, it's colonialism. And it's been this way since day one. Israel wasn't born in a vacuum. It was built on top of someone else's home. In 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled, more than 450 villages were wiped off the map, names changed, history buried. And what do we call it in the West? Israel's founding. As if it was some miracle. No, it was ethnic cleansing and it didn't end there. Since 1967, Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza has been treated like some temporary situation. It's been over 50 years. Temporary. They've built over 250 settlements in that time. Thousands of new homes for Israelis only, of course, on stolen land, while Palestinian homes get demolished with bulldozers. And Gaza? Gaza was a ghetto even before the utter destruction that is happening right now. A 2 million person open-air prison, fenced in, blockaded by land, sea and air. Israel controls everything, food, water, fuel, even how many calories Gazans are allowed to consume per day. That's not theory, that's policy. And every few years, when the resistance boils over, when people who have been caged, bombed and starved push back, what happens? The Western media lines up. Israel has the right to defend itself while it mows the lawn. Now let's talk 2025, because this year Israel didn't just bomb Gaza, it rolled in. Full ground invasion. Civilian death toll skyrocketing, entire neighborhoods flattened, hospitals, schools destroyed, tens of thousands of children buried under the rubble. And we're told it's necessary, it's surgical, it's moral. Ask yourself, objectively, how can mass starvation and carpet bombing on that level be moral? And the West? The West is writing checks and flying the cover. Trump's administration, the EU, the UK, they are all wringing their hands and say, we urge restraint. While shipping weapons, killing ceasefires and sending their media to echo the same tired scripts. They fund it, arm it, justify it and then act shocked when the region burns. And just like with Ukraine, it's all about values. Democracy, freedom, self-defense. This is selective, it's hollow. When Ukrainians resist, they call them heroes. When Palestinians resist, they call them terrorists. When Russia occupies, it's a war crime. When Israel occupies, it's security. And that's the selective lucidity that I'm talking about. Because if you can see through the lies about Ukraine but not about Gaza, or the other way around, that's not clarity, that's programming, that's selective lucidity. And if you feel uncomfortable right now, good. That means you're still thinking. You should feel uncomfortable supporting apartheid. You should feel rage when you see kids bombed to pieces with your tax money. You should feel disgusted when a government justifies siege warfare by calling it defense. So ask yourself, when you look at Gaza, what do you see? Victims? Savages? Terrorists? Or do you see what they are? People occupied, starving, resisting. And if you claim to stand for human rights, then you stand for them too. But let's not stop at outrage. Let's talk about why this keeps happening. Because once you see the cruelty, once you see Gaza under siege, once you see Ukraine burning, once you see the selective empathy, the media gymnastics, you've got to ask, who benefits? The answer is pretty simple. The US does. The empire does. This isn't just foreign policy, it's infrastructure, it's doctrine. Look, Washington doesn't back Israel because it cares about Jewish lives. It backs Israel because Israel is a forward operating base in the Middle East, a weapons testing ground, a surveillance partner. It's what US strategists used to proudly call an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East, a term used since the 1980s and repeated by policymakers for decades. Because if Israel didn't exist, as one of them said, we'd have to invent it. And Ukraine? Ukraine is not a democracy to be saved. It's a battering ram to smash into Russia. It's a pawn, a proxy. Since 2014, when the US-backed coup that toppled a democratically elected president and replaced it with a pro-Western puppet, Ukraine has been turned into a launching pad for NATO. That wasn't defense, it was offense. That was containment strategy dressed up in revolutionary speak. And what do we get in both places? Perpetual war, the golden goose of the military-industrial complex. Because war isn't just about land or ideology anymore, it's an economy. Raytheon stock rises with every single escalation. Lockheed Martin celebrates every arms package. News cycles spin faster. Think tank panels fill with talking heads who all somehow work for defense contractors. And the media? It serves the war machine like a PR department. They cry about refugees from Ukraine, but not from Gaza. They show the funerals of Israeli civilians, but hide the rubble of Palestinian schools and hospitals. They don't report, they manufacture consent. And underneath it all, it's the same pattern. Keep America in, Russia out and Germany down. That Cold War slogan hasn't aged a day. Ukraine weakens Russia. Gaza keeps the Middle East divided, and every step of it reinforces American supremacy. So next time you're told this is about values, freedom, democracy, peace, ask yourself, whose values, whose freedom, peace for whom? Because the pattern is very clear. Where there's endless war, there's endless profit. And if you're seeing only victims and villains, you're missing the board. This is empire management. So now it's time to get awake. You see the double standards, you see the propaganda, you see the blood on the hands of governments and the silence of institutions. That's good, that means you slowly get it. But now comes the real work, staying awake. Because this system isn't just feeding you lies, it's designing your perception. Every article, every headline, every carefully framed news segment is trying to train your brain to react on cue. Not to think, to react. That's the whole game. So what do? First, kill your trust. I mean it. Kill that instinct that tells you, oh, it's the BBC, so it must be accurate. Or this one's left or right-leaning, so it's on my side. No outlet is neutral. No outlet is safe. They're all embedded in power structures, whether corporate, state or ideology. Some of the worst disinformation is dressed up in sophistication. Second, follow the money. You want to know why every panel is filled with think tank shills and former generals. Because those voices are funded. They are there to shape your frame, not to inform your mind. Look up for yourself who funds the Atlantic Council. Look at how many ex-CIA or ex-IDF officials are suddenly analysts. These aren't objective voices, they're operatives in suits. Third, flip the camera. When you see a story, don't just watch it. Ask what's not being shown. Whose pain is invisible? Whose voice is missing? You see the bombed out buildings, but were you shown who lived there before? You see the screaming mother, but only from one side of the border. This is not journalism, it's selective storytelling. And it works only when you stop asking questions. Fourth, expose yourself. No, not like that. I mean, expose yourself to things that make you uncomfortable. Read the stuff you disagree with. Watch reports from media that you have been told are dangerous or biased. Because if you only ever consume what confirms your worldview, you're not informed, you're indoctrinated. Get uncomfortable. That's how you grow teeth. And finally, fight the reflex. You feel anger? Good. Now pause. Don't let them channel it into a target of their choosing. The most powerful propaganda doesn't lie to your face. It hijacks your emotions. It makes you feel before you think. It floods your heart so your brain shuts off. Resist it. Pause, reflect, investigate, and ask yourself every damn time, who benefits me believing this? Because once you reclaim your attention, once you make your mind a place they can't occupy, then you're dangerous. Then you're free. And that's when real resistance starts. You want to be lucid? Then be lucid everywhere. That's not a radical concept, it's human. So take this fire, take this lens, and don't let go of it when the next war hits your screen. Because the game doesn't end here. The next narrative is already loading. The next villain is already being cast. The next wave of outrage is already scheduled. But now you know how it works. And once you have seen the strings, the puppet show's never the same. That's your clarity. That's your power. Use it. One last thing in case you missed it. And it matters more than you might think. Critical voices like the ones on this channel, they are not just being ignored, they are being targeted, silenced, shadow banned, deplatformed. Not in theory, not in some distant Orwellian future, right now. You might not realize, but that is the point. I've got the numbers, the patterns and your messages that you're seeing on your screen right now to prove it. And if that's not enough proof for you, Twitter, now X, has suspended my account. No bots, no spam, no TOS violation. Just the wrong kind of questions aimed at the wrong kind of power. But here's the good news. They can't shut us all down if we decentralize. That's why I'm building a community on Substack. Substack is a place no algorithm can strangle, no platform oligarch can erase. So if you value sharp, unfiltered analysis that doesn't follow the mainstream narrative, the kind that cuts through propaganda instead of parroting it, join me there. Because if we don't support independent voices now, soon there won't be any left.